In 1939, Britain controlled the biggest empire ever. They owned a quarter of Earth's land and ruled a quarter of world's population. The pound was the world's reserve currency, and their navy dominated every ocean. Britain was number one. But just 17 years later, in 1956, Britain had to ask America for permission before acting on anything. By 1967, their money became nearly worthless. By 1976, they were begging international banks for emergency cash. So an empire that ran the world for 2 centuries became just another European country in 30 years. History books say Britain gave up its empire because people wanted freedom. That's partly true, but here's the reality. Britain went completely broke. Not morally broke, but actually ran out of money. Though Britain won against Hitler, they lost everything financially. I'll show you exactly how Britain bankrupted itself, how America took over, and why this matters for America today. Britain's empire didn't end by choice. It ended because the money ran out. After World War I, Britain's empire reached its peak. By 1920, they controlled 13.7 million square miles. That's nearly a quarter of Earth's land. They ruled 458 million people, which was 20% of the world's population. They had territory on every continent, but land wasn't their real power. Their real power was money. Everyone used British pounds for international trade. Whole countries kept pound as savings. London made all the big financial decisions. Britain lent money globally. British businessmen owned railroads in Argentina, mines in South Africa, farms in India, and factories in 6 continents. This financial control meant Britain borrowed cheaper than anyone else. They could fund a massive military easily and run colonies on debt. They controlled the world trade by controlling currency. Everything ran on the gold standard. Every pound could be exchanged for actual gold at a fixed price. You could walk in a bank with paper money and leave with gold bars. This made everyone trust the pound. Britain didn't have the world's biggest economy. America had already passed them. But for an island of just 44 million people, they produced incredibly, second only to America. British coal, steel, cloth, and machines powered the world. Their Royal Navy was still the biggest fleet anywhere. In 1920, Britain looked unbeatable, but financially, cracks were showing. World War I was the first disaster. From 1914 to 1918, the war costed Britain roughly 35 billion pounds. That might not sound huge today, but it was devastating then. Britain's entire economy in 1914 produced about only 2.5 billion pounds. The war costed 14 times their annual output. So where did this money come from? First, taxes skyrocketed. Income tax jumped from nearly 0 to 30%. But even crushing taxes couldn't cover everything. Second, borrowing. Britain borrowed heavily from citizens through war bonds, but crucially, borrowed massive sums from America. For the first time, Britain became net debtor to the US. By 1918, their debt exploded from 650 million pounds to over 7.4 billion. That's 11 times bigger in 4 years. Third, selling assets. Britain sold foreign investments to buy weapons and supplies. They liquidated huge chunks of overseas wealth just to survive. Then came the currency problem. In 1914, Britain abandoned the gold standard to print money for the war. The pound, which was reliable as gold for centuries, became just paper. They tried returning to gold standard in 1925 at the old rate, but they couldn't because the pound was massively overvalued, making British exports too expensive. This strangled the economy, causing deflation and unemployment throughout the 1920s. Britain had transformed from world's biggest lender to major debtor. America had gone from debtor to creditor. The global financial balance had fundamentally shifted, but most people didn't realize it. On the surface, Britain still looked dominant, but financially, they were barely hanging on. If World War I was expensive, then World War II destroyed them completely. The Second World War costed another 28 billion pounds. Compared to their shattered economy, this was impossible to handle. Britain fought through total mobilization. At the war's peak, 55% of entire country's output went to military spending. The entire economy existed just to fight. Food, fuel, and clothes were strictly rationed. Everything went towards survival, which was completely unsustainable. Britain burned through remaining wealth, selling assets and borrowing at the rate that would bankrupt any nation. By 1941, Britain was collapsing, and that's when America stepped in with Lend-Lease. America would lend weapons, food, and supplies for repayment after the war. But this wasn't charity. America charged interest, and for this lifeline, Britain had to accept American terms, dismantling trade preferences within the empire, opening it to American businesses, and accepting American financial oversights. Britain was trading its empire for survival, and America was buying the global dominance at discounted price. The result was catastrophic debt. By 1945, Britain's national debt was 250% of GDP. The debt was 2.5 times bigger than their entire economy. For comparison, US debt today is around 123% of GDP. Greece at its worst was 180%. Britain in 1945 was in a league of its own. However, if debt to GDP crosses 100%, then from there, things starts going out of control. To service this debt, Britain sold everything possible. Foreign investments were liquidated, gold reserves were depleted, overseas holdings like art, building, or anything valuable got sold. By 1945, Britain had transformed from world's largest creditor to the world's largest debtor. It took just 30 years and 2 world wars to reach at this position. Britain was now completely dependent on America. They owed the US over $4.3 billion, a crushing burden on its shattered economy. Britain needed American loans just to feed their people. While the war raged, America and Britain met at Bretton Woods to design post-war financial system. Britain's economist John Maynard Keynes proposed a neutral international currency, but America, represented by Henry Dexter White, wanted the dollar as the new reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Britain, bankrupt from 2 wars, couldn't argue. America held all the cards. The dollar replaced the pound. This wasn't just technical, it was the biggest power transfer of the 20th century. Being the reserve currency means everyone needs your money for trade. It creates constant global demand. You can run huge trade deficits indefinitely because the world needs your dollars. You borrow at the lowest rates and your banks dominate globally. For 200 years, Britain enjoyed these advantages. Overnight, they went to America. Immediately, the pound crisis began. Britain tried maintaining pound's value, but fundamentals were broken. Their debt was 250% of GDP, their economy was shattered, they were running massive trade deficits, and the dollar was now king. The pound was massively overvalued, and everyone knew it. But admitting this meant admitting Britain was no longer a great power. The first humiliation came in 1949. Britain was forced to devalue the pound by 30%, from $4.30 to $2.80. Great powers don't devalue their currency. But even this didn't solve the problem. Britain simply couldn't afford its empire anymore. Maintaining an empire meant military garrisons globally, naval presence everywhere, vast colonial administration, infrastructure investments, and constantly fighting independence movements. Britain's economy was half of America's size, but they were trying to maintain a global footprint the mass didn't support. The breaking point was the Suez Crisis of 1956. Egypt's leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which was vital for shipping, especially for the Middle Eastern oil. Britain, owning 44% of the canal company, didn't accept this. With France and Israel, they launched a military operation to retake it. Militarily, they succeeded. Within days, British and French forces occupied the canal zone. But then America intervened. President Eisenhower was furious. He threatened to bring Britain to its knees, not with bombs, but with finances. America threatened economic sanctions, cutting off oil supplies, and critically selling its vast holding of British pounds. This would have crashed the currency. America also bluffed emergency loans Britain needed desperately from the IMF. It was financial blackmail. Britain's reserves were draining, the pound was collapsing, and America delivered an ultimatum: withdraw from Suez or face total financial ruin. Britain had no choice. Despite their military victory, they withdraw in complete humiliation. The Suez Crisis revealed the New World Order. British military power meant nothing without American financial approval. The empire was a facade and America was pulling the strings. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in disgrace. The pound came under attack, and independence movement saw Britain was weak, accelerating their push for freedom. Swiss didn't cause empire's end, but it made it undeniable and irreversible. The decline continued. In 1967, Britain devalued the pound again by 14%. Prime Minister Harold Wilson famously told people the pound in your pocket hadn't been devalued. It was a lie. This was the second major devaluation in less than 20 years. So why did this keep happening? Well, Britain was consuming more than producing, running constant trade deficits. When you have the reserve currency, you can get away with this. But Britain didn't anymore. They had to pay for imports with foreign currency, and they constantly ran out. The Bank of England tried defending the pound by selling reserves and raising interest rates. But this was a losing battle. Devaluation was inevitable. Through the 1960s and 70s, Britain became the sick man of Europe. The country suffered stagflation, which means high inflation and stagnant economy. Strikes paralyzed industries. The energy crisis worsened everything. Manufacturing collapsed and the smartest people left for America. The nation that had been the wealthiest on earth 50 years prior was now in managed decline. The ultimate humiliation came in 1976, facing another currency collapse. Britain had to beg the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. The IMF agreed, but with harsh conditions. Cut spending, raise interest rates, implement austerity. The nation that once ruled a quarter of the world was taking orders from international bureaucrats. During this period, Britain rapidly ended its empire. India in 1947, Malaysia in 1957, most African colonies in the 1960s, and Hong Kong in 1997. The official story was moral enlightenment and gracefully granting independence, but that was not the reality. Reality was that Britain was bankrupt. Every colony drained the treasury. The empire had to go because bills couldn't be paid. The lesson from this was that Britain's collapse followed a clear pattern. First, massive debts from wars. Second, loss of reserve currency status. Third, persistent deficits from consuming more than producing. Fourth, repeated currency devaluation. Fifth, becoming dependent on foreign creditors. And finally, loss of political independence and forced asset liquidation. Now look at America today. Debt accumulation is over $38 trillion and counting from endless wars and spending. Decline in the dollar's reserve status. It's slow, but it's happening. Persistent trade deficits. Currency pressure. The dollar has lost over 86% of its purchasing power since 1971. Rising debt costs. Interest payments now exceed the entire defense budget. Growing constraints on America's actions. The final stage for Britain was empire liquidation. The terrifying question for America is, what will America liquidate? The critical difference is speed. Britain took 30 years to go from dominant empire to IMF bailout case. In today's hyper-fast, interconnected financial world, what took Britain 3 decades could take America half that time if the trajectory continues. The warning from history is stark. Britain didn't choose to end its empire. It was forced to end by financial reality. Empires don't end because of moral progress. They end because they go broke. Financial power is the only real power. Military strength is meaningless if you can't afford to sustain it. Having the world's reserve currency is the ultimate superpower. Britain learned this the hard way. America is next. If you found this insightful, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.